Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you tonight. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you, obviously, for joining us. We really appreciate your time and seeing you here. Sorry, just one moment, one little technical thing. So tonight is our November Mutual Curiosity Program. My name is Emma Amos. I'm the Executive Director of the Interfaith Centre of Northeast Florida. I've seen many of your faces before or recognise your names. You've attended some of our previous events, both in person and online. So thank you for attending again tonight. This is our 8th Mutual Curiosity Program for 2020. We have first one live, and since then we've been online, which has been great. We've received a really good response for tonight, so we're so pleased to see all of your faces. For those that are new to the Interfaith Centre of Northeast Florida, we are a non-profit. Our aim is to encourage people to interact, to open dialogue and have conversations both with people of faith and non-religious people, to learn more about their culture, their faith, in a enjoyable and entertaining environment. We develop events that we hope that all people, no matter what your background, can take something out of and learn something about the diversity of both religion and culture in Northeast Florida. Finally, we hope that next year we'll be able to go back to some in-person events. We host an annual awards and dialogue dinner. We also have a great event which we do jointly host with the Jacksonville Jewish Center for Shabbat and Ramadan. We think probably for 2021 we may not be able to do it in person, but we hope you might be able to join us online for that conversation. It's a really good event. And the majority of our programs are no cost. We try and keep them free so that as many people as possible can attend. So we are very grateful to our sponsors for their donations to keep us, give us the ability to create these programs. If anybody feels that they get some value out of tonight's program or any of the previous ones that you've attended and you would like to donate, we have a donate button on our website, which is interfaith, nefl.org. Any donations, any contributions, no matter how small, are greatly appreciated. So now I'm going to hand over to Matt Hartley, who is the chair of the Interfaith Centre of Northeast Florida, and he's going to give us an introduction to our program tonight. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Emma. Good evening, everyone. It's good to see all of you. And I just put in the group chat. So if you see that, there's a link to our website, which is where you can learn all about our previous and upcoming events, and where that donate button is on the front page as well. So tonight's event is on religious nationalisms. And we've been having conversations for a couple of years in our organization about the intersection of different nationalisms. A couple of years ago, we were talking about Christian nationalism as the Trump administration began, and as we began to see some trends of Christianity and nationalism coming together in his campaign and then in his presidency. And then we spoke with board members who could point out similar dynamics in some cases in their country of origin. So one of our board members, Dr. Parvez Ahmed, who may not be able to join us tonight, unfortunately, well, he was planning to be with us to speak a little bit about Hindu nationalism in India. So if that's something you miss out on tonight, that may be something that you'll be able to learn more about. We can find some resources to share, and I'm sure that he can share some with us. And then one of our founders and board members, Alex Devar, would talk about nationalism in Turkey, Islamic nationalism. So we're seeing all these things come together, all these similar struggles that we're having, and especially the issues of intolerance that come along with these nationalisms. So we thought, okay, we need to learn more and we need to think about how these things are connected. So one of the people that I thought of immediately is my former professor and now colleague, Dr. Julie Ingersoll from UNF. Way back, you know, I'm an old man now, I'm 37 years old, and back in 2005, Dr. Ingersoll read my senior thesis, and then now I'm the director of the Interfaith Center at UNF, and we've had an opportunity to collaborate with Dr. Ingersoll in the Religious Studies Department on several occasions, which has been great. So we knew we needed to get her here to talk about Christian nationalism. So that's where we're going to start tonight, and then you're going to hear from Alex Savar about Turkey. If fingers crossed, Parvez might be able to join us. If he gets here, he'll share with us. If not, then we'll move on into our moderated panel and Q&A to give you an opportunity to ask questions. So with that, I'll pass things over to Dr. Ingersoll. It's yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is really kind of fun. I'm impressed with how well these Zoom conferences work. You don't even have to go out. It's really nice. So my most recent book is on an obscure movement in conservative Protestantism that really laid the groundwork for the rise of the religious right in the 1950s. And we were calling it, when I wrote the book about 2010, came out in 2015, Dominionism, but it now has taken on another name, which I think is actually in many ways much better. So I do have a little PowerPoint slide. I'm not a slave to these, but I think that it helps. Us frame things and stay on task. And it's not opening. Really? Okay, hold on a minute. There we go. Sorry about this, folks. I see Danielle's here, so she knows that I'm not very good at this because she's in my classes. Anyway, so this is the title of the book. So some of this is taken from that, and some of it is more current research. But in terms of defining Christian nationalism, it's a specific form of Christianity that arises from conservative Protestantism and has become deeply interwoven with nationalism to produce a distinct ideology and an identity that's driving a lot of our current politics. As I mentioned, another name for this really is dominionism. To start, I think it's helpful to lay out a little bit of framing so that you understand what we do in the religious studies program with regard to how we approach the study of religion. We see religion as historically and culturally situated. So my training is in history and sociology rather than theology. We kind of assume that there's no pure form of Christianity that exists sort of out there in the ether, and that Christianity is what Christians do. And it's much more than just an emphasis on beliefs and theology. I have a note here about this guy named Bevington that we could talk about, how evangelicalism gets defined theologically and what's wrong with that. And we could talk about that later if it's interesting to you. These are what I consider to be the key characteristics of Christian nationalism in the US. So this is largely white and it's male-centered. As you see, the image here I have is of a woman. I'm not saying that it's all men, but it tends to be male-centered. So when you see leadership, they tend to be men. When women are active in it, they tend to be women who are deferring to the opinions of men. So you have this kind of largely white male-centered characteristic. It's also deeply anti-science. This goes back to fighting over creationism and evolution, but you also find evidence of the anti-science bias in conversations about global warming and climate change, as well as anti-vaxxing, and we're going to get to that in just a little bit. You find an alternative version of American history that's very much rooted into this theological notion that somehow America is special and that God has chosen America and that God protects America. And And history is told as a theological narrative demonstrating the relationship between God and America. So they are often at odds with traditional scholarly historians. They are deeply anti-democratic, and I'm not using that language to talk about my label for them in recent days. What I mean by that is that there is explicit writing that I trace out in my book of anti-democratic principles. So there's no sense that somehow democracy is the best form of government. A government that is a Christian government is the best form of government. And that could be democratic, it could be a monarchy, it could be any number of other kinds of structures, but the emphasis is on the kind of Christian orientation of it. It is apocalyptic. That is, it imagines a coming cataclysm between the Christian nationalists and kind of everybody else. And you see that playing out in lots of the conflicts that we have just in these days after the election. It's conspiracist, and you see a good deal of overlap between Christian nationalists and groups like QAnon. And there's a central emphasis on the notion of an anticipated persecution and a sense of the possibility of martyrdom. So in conflicts over the legality of marriage equality, for example, the conflict gets framed as the persecution of Christians rather than the expansion of political rights to people who didn't have them before. And each of these things are things that we could have talked about for an hour. But I thought maybe we would just list them, and then the ones that you find most interesting that you'd like to either ask about or share what you know about later on during the discussion section of our time tonight. It seems like that might be a good jumping off point. So in any conversation about these folks, I always get somebody who wants to talk about whether or not they're really Christians, and I can totally understand that. They aren't Christians in the way that most Christians want to think of Christians. This isn't the dominant part of Christianity. It's not representative of all Christianity. But in any academically defensible sense of what counts as Christian, we have to admit that these are Christians. To say otherwise is this rhetorical protective strategy that prevents critique of Christianity itself. Effectively what philosophers call the no true Scotsman's fallacy. If every time something gets criticized, you can say, yes, but those aren't real Christians, then Christianity itself can never be criticized. And these folks embrace sort of historical, traditional, cultural forms of aspects of Christianity. They certainly embrace traditional Christian beliefs. They come out of the historic tradition of Christianity, particularly Protestantism in the US. So I just thought I'd throw that one out there to get by it. But we could talk about that more if people wanted to also. And then finally, as a conclusion from my comments, I think that what we're going to see from these folks in the coming months are a real uptick in the conspiracy theories, particularly QAnon, but also with regard to voting and with regard to, let me come back to that. I think we're going to continue to see an emphasis on the persecution narratives. But one of the things that's most interesting to me right now is that there are some good sociological studies demonstrating the overlap between people who measure high levels for Christian nationalism and people who resist COVID protections, masking and isolating and those kinds of things, and also vaccines. And it's probably rooted in this ideological framework in which America is this special protected place where God is going to take care of the people who follow God. And that so people don't perceive that they are necessarily the ones at risk for this. And they also believe that efforts at vaccination and even masking bleed into conspiracy theories. So for today, I was reading, for example, an article about Christian nationalists arguing that mask mandates would serve as a precursor to forcing dangerous vaccinations on everybody. Because, it's as though once we've kind of broken this boundary and taken away that freedom is the way that it's framed. So the foray is made with the practice of masking because it's marginally unobjectionable, but that the goal is really a kind of mass coerced vaccination program. So that's what they're talking about these days. And I think that's about my 10 minutes. So I'll look forward to conversation as we move forward. I don't believe Parvez has showed up. Is that correct? I'm only seeing a couple of you here. So I believe that means that it's my turn to toss the discussion over to Alex Sivar.
Thank you, Julie. That was very enlightening, and I cannot wait to get to the questions and answers. And I have a couple of questions myself, actually. That's wonderful. My name is Alex Sivar. I'm a Jacksonville resident and one of the board members at the Interfaith Center, Northeast Florida. It is such a great to see everybody on board. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Matt, for all your hard work. We appreciate it very much. When the offer came to me about maybe over 2 months ago, the Hagia Sophia, turning the museum of Hagia Sophia into a mosque back in July was very current. It was making the news, but all of us noticed that after 2 months, nobody's talking about it, right? So that's a testimony in a way that this was not really out of a necessity or some kind of a religious requirement of, or we didn't have enough spaces in Istanbul to pray. So we had to get this big cathedral or basilica to open up so all these faithful can go in there and do their prayers. So we all know that. I would like to share just a couple of things here, if I may. So this picture is the Friday after July 2020, I think 24, it was Wednesday. The following Friday, which is the communal prayer of the Islamic tradition, was taking place in the Hagia Sophia for the first time since 1934. Little bit history behind the Hagia Sophia. Of course, Common Era 300, the first temple was done by the Byzantium, and the 400, when the Roman Empire became Christian Empire, this became a basilica. Again, the first and the second version of Hagia Sophia were demolished. I mean, right now, those of you who were able to see Hagia Sophia is the third building. So the third building was built in 5 years, 532 to 537 Common Era, by the Eastern Roman Empire, which is also known as Byzantium Empire. So from 537 CE all the way to 1453. So it's about 1,000 years. This was a largest structure. I think for 900 years, it was the largest structure in the whole wide world. This is it. This was the biggest building. And of course, it was the largest basilica. And in 1453, Ottoman Empire, the seventh Sultan of the dynasty, Muhammad II, conquered Istanbul. At the time, it was Constantinopolis, and converted this big building into a mosque. So the history behind this mosque is that there is a tradition in Ottoman Empire. If there is a conquest of another country, right after the soldiers hoist the flag on the highest building, they also go for the highest or the largest house of worship and convert that, whatever it might be, whether it's a synagogue or church or anything else, into a mosque. So this is a tradition, and that's the reason why in May of 1453, when Muhammad II took over Istanbul, the siege was over, and Hagia Sophia, the Hagia Sophia, was turned into a mosque. up until 1934, which is the modern Turkish Republic. In 1934, the cabinet, the parliament took a decision to convert this into a museum. In light of all the Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, and it was really a UNESCO's United Nations historical site. Therefore, they said, you know, this should be serving the humanity much better if it was a museum. So from 1934 up until 2020, this past July, it was museum. I'm sure some of the folks who are on this call have seen Hagia Sophia. I know Emma did. And I had the good fortune of seeing it several times. It is a magnificent building. I mean, the minute you walk in, you realize how magnificent this building is after 1,000 years. So the reason I put the first picture is, if you notice that he is an imam, he's actually the chief imam of Turkish Republic. He is the director of religious affairs, which is a government agency directly connected to the presidency. So if you notice, he's holding a sword, right? So when we talk about average Muslim like yours truly, we always say the Islam is the religion of peace. So why would he hold that sword while he is doing the sermon on the first Friday of Hagia Sophia turning into a mosque? So that's interesting. Interesting thing is, Ottoman Empire had a tradition that some of the mosques that have been converted from another house of worship would be a right, because Ottoman soldiers or the army went there, they fought, they got the location, therefore right now symbolizing our victory. Of course, those days everything was a zero-sum game, right? So, you know, we have the right to convert it. So that's the reason traditionally on those mosques, when the sermon is given, it's called a recovered or conquest mosque. Therefore, the imam is holding that sword symbolically. So the second one, this is in 1934. It was the cabinet minutes showing that 12 ministers in the Turkish Republic with the Kemal Atatürk, which is the first president of Turkey, showing that in November of 1934, they decided to turn this mosque into a museum. So as Julie was discussing the Christian nationalism, there is really, I wouldn't say there is Islamic nationalism, because Muslims are encouraged to have one brotherhood, one community, one large community with a very diverse nationalities. So if you go to any mosque in Jacksonville, anywhere else, you will see different colors, different nationalities, but they are all identify themselves as Muslims. So it's very difficult to say Islamic nationalism, but the political Islam uses nationalism in order to really hold on to the power. We saw that in Egypt with Ikhwan, with the Brotherhood. We saw that now in Turkey with Erdogan. So Erdogan comes into the power, and in order to hold on to the power, he really has to go in and collaborate with the ultra-nationalist of Turkish party. And now, of course, once you do the coalition, you have to really give in. So what happened? If you look at that signature of Kemal Atatürk, so in 2019, some nationalists said, you know what, this signature doesn't look like Atatürk's original signature. So therefore, this decree or the law that has been passed in 1934 is really not legitimate. So therefore, we want to really take this to the upper court, to the Supreme Court of Turkey, and have them to decide if it is true, if it is not his real signature. Therefore, we can really eliminate this law, turning Hagia Sophia into a museum, and therefore we can convert it back to the mosque. So this was the legal maneuvering behind this. It is not like, you know, you can just go out and say, well, tomorrow we are changing it to mosque. So this was the backdrop. And of course, I don't know if this signature is right or wrong, but for some reason, almost 80 plus years, nobody objected. And all of a sudden, when the political Islam government of Erdogan sees that there is some kind of a weakening in the power in Turkey, so this would be the best way to really energize the masses. And, you know, they have economical problems. They have Turkey has 7 neighbors, and out of 7 neighbors, with 6 of them, Turkey is fighting some different scales of war. So really, peace with neighbors, Islam is the religion of peace, doesn't work. So he really has to go in and resort some kind of energizing his base. And this is all behind the decision to turn it. Because if you look at it, in March of 2019, during one of his speeches, Erdogan was asked by a listener saying, well, why don't we turn, because turning Hagia Sophia, converting Hagia Sophia to a mosque has always been a soft point for all the Muslims in Turkey. So whenever the politician wants to resort to some kind of a hot point, they will always fall back into the Hagia Sophia, let's make it mosque again. So in March of 2019, he was asked, he says, why don't we really turn into a mosque again? And his answer was, please listen to this. His answer was, well, listen, cross the street from Hagia Sophia, you got Blue Mosque. There is nobody praying in the Blue Mosque. You cannot even fill the Blue Mosque. Why would you want to turn this museum into a mosque? So this was Erdogan's answer, which is on the record. But of course, fast forward a year later, the political situation changes, and then now he's the one who goes and actually initiates this to turn it into a mosque. So those are the pictures. And the last one is, of course, it's nothing to do with the politics or anything. It's one of the beauties of Hagia Sophia. Of course, in the dome, which is the largest dome that carries without a column the whole weight of that dome, is a beautiful architecture. And on the 4 corners of that dome, you will see these pictures of angels with 4 wings. And this one is Archangel Gabriel, and has been covered, of course, in the past, but right now they uncovered it. But if you notice that the clothing underneath during the Fridays or the prayer times, this has been raised again to cover the images, because in Islamic tradition, there are no images allowed in the house of worships. Finally, I'm taking a little bit longer because Pervez is not here, so I'm gonna compensate for that. So Religious Freedom Report, which is done every year by the State Department, Religious Freedom Report, it really doesn't score Turkey any good scores. It's of course, if one looks at any report, 99.8% of Turkey is Muslim, and the rest is only 4 minorities, religious minorities really accepted, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Christians, and Jews. So those are the 4 minorities that the government accepts as a religious minority. But if you look at them, their properties and all their freedom has been really, since this 2002, which Erdogan has been in power for 19 years, has been really narrowed down to very few spaces that given to anyone that is not a Muslim. And so that's kind of a sad in that respect. But I will take questions if anybody has any question about the converting a museum into a mosque in Hagia Sophia. Please, we'll go back and answer that. So I will turn it over to Lucinda. Dr. Mosher is the Doctor of Theology, also a board member. Lucinda, it's all yours.
Thank you. So we're going to give the first question to Alex. Alex says he has a question for Julie. So Alex, what question did you have for Julie? Thank you both for your presentations, by the way.
My question was the QAnon. I think she had mentioned that group a couple of times in relation to the Christian nationalism. My knowledge of QAnon is really what I heard on the radios on and off, but what I hear is so bizarre, their conspiracy theories, and I found it very difficult for any believer, any faithful to really believe that. So what is their game? I mean, how is that possible? That if somebody would have said to me, these people are conspiracy theorists, I would have understood, but how the religion comes into play here. I don't know how Christians believe in anything like this.
Alex, could you please unshare your screen so that I can see all the other people?
Sure.
There, thank you.
There we
Okay.
go.
Julie,
Great,
what do you
Hi.
have to? Yeah.
Well, it's really difficult to talk about Christians in general in this sense. Actually, you cannot. But the particular Christians that I was talking about, the Christian nationalist Christians, are very much conspiratorial. I mean, it's all the way down in their understanding of their Christianity. And so there's just it's a natural matchup. I mean, they think that the forces of good and evil are cosmically at war with each other in the here and now, all around us. You know, kind of spiritual warfare notion is very much alive for these folks. Now, that's not Christians in general. You certainly wouldn't find that in a Catholic church. And if you went to the Episcopal church down in Ponte Vedra, you wouldn't find that. So it is it's a specific kind of Christianity.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Yeah. Thank you.
And Julie, I was looking to see if anybody has raised their hand. Do you have a question for Alex?
I was interested, yes, I do actually, thank you. I was interested in, I'm glad I did. I was interested in the listing of the groups that you gave when you talked about the groups that have a status, a politically tolerated status. And it said, you listed 3 different, so you said the Eastern Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, and Christian. And I was curious about like, what is, if, because those are all Christians. So which kind of Christian is it that they're just calling Christian?
Mostly, we call it Levantarian. Those are the Protestants and Anglican. You know, those are the European Christians that came
I see. Yeah.
towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. And for certain capitulations, they were given some tax exemptions, so they came in as traders and settled in the coastal cities of Turkey. But the Armenian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox Jews and the Christians are the ones that I mentioned. They are recognized because right after the First World War, when Ottoman Empire was on the losing side of the war, in the Lausanne, when the treaty was signed, these were the 4 religious minorities that were recognized.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we would love for you all gathered here to ask your questions. And the easiest way to do that is if you know how to click on the little thing that makes your hand raise, you can do that, or you can simply hold your hand up and I'm going to flip through the pages and see who's got a question. So raise your hand either with the little device or your real hand and let me know that. Yeah. Okay, I see Audrey. Audrey, unmute yourself and ask your question.
My question is for Julie. By my code of ethics, the behavior of some politicians is diabolical, if not satanic. I guess I'm being a little dramatic here. I don't understand how people who purport to be following God's laws can excuse such reprehensible behavior and follow the particular politician.
Okay, so in order to answer that, I'm going to have to be less general, right? Because you know, like,
You know what I'm
I'm
saying.
assuming that you're asking how can people profess to be Bible-believing Christians and follow Donald Trump given his character. And there's a number of different ways that they do that. But I think the first place to think about that is in terms of the way in which we tend to prioritize our own sensibilities about what is right and true and extrapolate from there to what religion is. And in fact, I think, well, so for example, you know, I think that racism is wrong. So I would imagine if I were a religious person, I would think that religion dictates that we not be racist. But this form of Christianity goes all the way back to the kind of pre-Civil War America and embraces all kinds of ideas about how society should be ordered that include racism. And so I don't know that you can make that kind of, I think you have to make a more, if you want, I mean, ethically and morally, you don't have to make it more complex because I agree with you, they're just wrong. But I think if you say you don't understand how they could do it, if you want to understand it, then you have to recognize that what they think is right and true is not necessarily what you think is right and true, and not what I think is right and true. I mean, their version of Christianity, their version of truth is quite far afield from mine, and I suspect from yours. Does that help? That's a very long conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Susan and Brooke are the next two, and so Susan.
So what can we do about people with, and I'll just make my own judgment here, bad views, such everybody will have their own definition of what bad means. But in our country, we have very, you know, hopefully we still have really strong church-state separation, and people can believe whatever they want. But should they be get taxpayer money, for instance, or should they get exemptions from current laws? I mean, a lot of our church-state separation, part of our Constitution, should try to help the country from being harmed by religious extremists. Do you agree with that, or could you expound on that concept?
Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me?
Anybody that'll take it, yeah, if you'll take it. Dr. Ingersoll, your response, yes.
I certainly agree with you that I prefer that that's how it were. I'm not as clear that that is how it is. The constitutional protections for the separation of church and state were really addressed to Congress. And so the federal government couldn't mix religion and tech and public support, but states did and could, and actually still do. So one of the things I trace in the book that I wrote is that the way in which this thing that we now call Christian nationalism was built was about a 50-year plan and project that had a lot to do with undermining public education and replacing it with Christian education, whether that was private Christian schools or Christian homeschooling. And one of the things in the book is half a chapter about a Christian school over on the Panhandle that teaches all this stuff and is subsidized by the state of Florida. And the state has, the courts in Florida have decided that that's constitutional. So you and I might prefer that it not be, but in theory, I think it is. So I would suppose that, you know, I don't know how to solve the problem that we're in. And I think it gets down to disagreement over truth and actually an abandonment of truth. So I'm not sure I have a good answer to the resolution to the problem that we face. But I'm not thinking that the church-state separation is nearly as much as we would like to think it is or should be.
I'd love to jump in just for a moment. I know that Dr. Ingersoll used a book, taught some of a book this semester, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity by Robert P. Jones. And this book kind of traces the story of white supremacy with white Christianity in America.
Mhm.
And Jones' suggestion for his part is that one of the things that has to happen is that white churches and white Christians really have to start to own the history that we have, that it wasn't somebody else that did all this stuff. It was white Christians who tightened slavery chains, who tightened lynching nooses, who tightened Jim Crow laws. I mean, I'm a white Christian, so I'm saying that was us that did that. And so at least Robert P. Jones, he says that's one part of what has to happen is the white Christians and white churches have to hold themselves to account for our history and make repair. So he's talking about going beyond saying we're sorry this happened and it was our people, but then saying how are we going to make a substantive repair of the damage that has been done historically.
And I think one thing that was particularly effective about that book is he's not only a white Christian writing about his own tradition in a broad sense. He's not really, well, he may be now, but he's not like a progressive white Christian. Because I think too often we get, progressive religious folks, whether they're Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and they're in conversation with each other over some shared values, but they're not in conversation with the fundamentalist versions of their own traditions. And in fact, they have much less in common with the fundamentalist versions in their own traditions than they do each other, despite they are different religions, right? But Jones comes out, he's a Southern Baptist, and he came out of Southern Seminary, and his background is that world. So while he may have embraced some progressive values, I don't actually know his personal politics, but his background is very much the across that divide that I think it's very hard for most of us to get across. That's a good book. Highly recommended.
Okay. Next, I have on my list, Brooke will ask her question, and then James, you're after Brooke. Brooke?
I'm going to get back in line after this because I have a few, but
That's good.
I do, and I think this is for anyone, especially I know the people that are on the council probably think about this a lot, but just hearing y'all talk, I just have this sense of powerlessness to have increased awareness of the dynamics at play. And this is a value judgment, but I do find them a little scary and a little bit harmful, more than a little bit harmful. So I'm just wondering, how do y'all cope with that sense of this is so tightly wound, and to see, to have awareness of all the harm that this brings? How do you know that this is at play and see it growing, but still find hope and find ways to act against it in ways that are meaningful to you?
Matt, would you like to take that one?
I'd love to hear Alex's thoughts on that one.
Okay, Alex, how do you keep your sanity?
A good question, and it's a tough one. I mean, quite frankly, how do you keep in the Islamic tradition, there is a principle that the faith is really between hope and fear. So really, of course, what it meant is that the fear of doing something wrong and hope that, God is most compassionate, merciful, most forgiving, therefore there is always a hope. Right? Listen, it's challenging. I am, from my own homeland or here in the States, I spend more time here than my own country. But really, in the last 4 years, especially, it's been very challenging. I mean, Julie just put it so delicately that, not all Christians are in that category, but it's evangelists, and how can they really vote for the president when they are doing that? But of course, when you speak to them, they try to give you some kind of answers. But in my own personal experience, I always hold on to that hope and the fear, and then at the end, the oneness of God, and then he will eventually prevail. That gives me the hope. I mean, that's
Thank
all
you.
I can tell you.
All right, we're going to go to James, then Sukhbir, then Frank. James? James, unmute yourself. There you go.
I wanted to comment on this concern of how do we overcome the situation we're in today with the right and the left and the closeness of the election and how the nation is totally split. And if we go back to what Julie was saying earlier about the 19th century and the social Darwinism,
Yeah.
the whole Darwinian movement was split fundamentalist Christians who didn't believe in science to those who did believe in the science of Darwinism. They were pretty influential in society for a period of time. Their roles subsided with industrialization and in the progressive era after 1900, but came back again in the 1920s with the KKK and other groups that were William Jennings Bryan headed, and then subsided again during the 30s and 40s, and have come back again, partly after World War II, but again, most recently in the 21st century. And the question becomes, well, in my mind, I'm a retired professional historian. You have a relatively small number of people on the left, a relatively small number on the right, all of whom are animated by their beliefs, however insane they may be. But in the middle, you have a great mass of people. You look at the statistics, how many are Republican, how many are Democrat, and how many are independent. A third of our voters in Florida are independent voters. And it's this middle ground of people who hopefully, this is where Alex's hope comes in, hopefully will subside and under a Biden administration that does some good things and not be disruptive in support of the far right or the Christian nationalists. And the Christian nationalists will go back into their own, I don't want to say tunnels, but in their own, into their own area of supporting one another, but with much less influence upon our society. This is my hope that this will happen in the next 4 to 8 or 12 years.
Thank you. Sukhbir.
Okay. Yeah, this is Sudhir Prabhu. I agree. I mean, the whole topic of today is religious intolerance, nationalism, and the future of, my question is, I agree. We are all concerned about what's happening in this country. We should be. And we talked about Turkey, and I think India was on the list to speak about. But, these are new phenomena which are happening around the world. But what we didn't touch on is the intolerance that existed as a norm even before these new movement has started. For instance, there's 6 countries in the world have Buddhism as their state religion. About 20 have Christianity as the state religion. Many, many more have Islam as their state religion. There is hardly any distance between the church and the state in many of these states. Interreligious marriage is not allowed. Proselytization is not allowed. Apostasy is punished by death. The law, or the religious law is the law, becomes civil law. So there is, when in these countries, we don't talk about it. We talk about this new phenomenon as if everything was hunky-dory before that. No, there is tremendous intolerance which exists in the world, which is not voiced. So the question I have for the moderators is, why so? We are so vocal when something new happens, which we should, don't get me wrong, but there is hardly any, passion or, activism when things are already in many countries, intolerance exists if you don't belong to the major religion. The minorities there is a lot of intolerance. So I just wanted to, in these countries, who talks about nationalism? Who talks about interfaith this thing in the world and in the world order? So I just see, for instance, there is no country so far in the world where Jainism is a state religion, or Sikhism is a state religion, or Hinduism is a state religion. So there is a lot of difference, geopolitical as well as religio-political in the world, which we don't look at the entire picture as a whole.
Thank you. That's sort of a statement more than a question. And can anybody field that question? My answer as the moderator is, we can't cover everything in one night. So we're going to just, I think the particular state of,
things are happening in this country, and that's why we are discussing this. But it never happened that these continued for decades, if not
So my
never discussed openly.
And perhaps we can take that up at another time. But I think for tonight, we'll just have to start somewhere. My list says that Frank is next. Frank, are you still with us? And do you have a question?
Yeah, I certainly do. Sort of a comment and a question. And Lord, so many things to say. First off, thanks for hosting this. But in my recollection and in studies, it's really interesting that when the Scopes trial ended, the fundamentalists sort of went into a cocoon and into hiding. Yet in a post-World War II environment, they started surfacing in these small independent Bible colleges, and this fundamentalism was taught. And the rise of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority was no longer about seeing Jesus as a passive peacemaker, but as a 6'6", defensive end going to take your head off. And this has become this rallying cry, and it's just tragic. And I'm inclined to think that the mainstream moderate, Christians, of us have just sort of passively said, oh, well, this will pass. They got to express themselves. This is part of a democracy. And we don't realize that it's a threat. There's a real threat here, because, when you repeat a lie enough and no one questions it, people start to believe it. And I think we hear that, from the White House, current white occupant of the White House. And I'm inclined to think there's really a call for more, action on the part of the moderates, that we have to speak out against this, because it is just, it's tragic. It's a real fear. And I'm really curious what, some of the moderators think. Are we seeing more moderate people of faith starting to speak out against this rise of fundamentalism?
I'm not a moderate, but I'd like to jump in if it's okay. Is that okay?
Please do. Yeah.
Because this connects up with what Sudhir was talking about, although I didn't say it when he was speaking, because it didn't answer directly his concern about what we're not talking about. But in fact, the book that I wrote, and I've been writing about this stuff since 2000, the book that I wrote was about a strategy put out in about the 1950s to transform all of American culture into a theocracy. And it wasn't a conspiracy. They wrote out in public what they were doing, and they put these things in place, and we're seeing some of it come to fruition. So it's not new. And I do think it's a danger. I mean, there are people who would like to see the United States become a theocracy. And they are people who have more power than they ought to, given their numbers, but the rest of us Americans have a short attention span, and we think at most in terms of election cycles, and they write in 200-year strategies. Like, they think everybody needs to have a 200-year family dynasty plan, and this is what they do, and they've been doing it since the 1950s. So yeah, I think that we should pay attention. I've been screaming in the wilderness.
Yeah, and keep screaming.
I will, yeah.
Yeah. Hey, thank you. I think we have time to slip in one more question, and it will be from Danielle. Ed, I don't know whether we'll get to you, but I'll try. Danielle?
Hi, this question is for you, Dr. Ingersoll. I think QAnon.
Danielle's my student.
Ah,
I think QAnon is a really unique situation, and I guess I was wondering, how do Christian nationalists sort of give the status of like martyrdom to Q as a person, because or not even as a person? And I guess I'm asking, what do you think is different, if anything, from real people like Donald Trump or Jesus, if you think there's evidence for like a historical Jesus that makes Q such an important person?
Boy, Danielle, I don't know that I can answer that. What I see is this intersection of a temperament, because as Danielle knows, and Matt and a few of you, the rest of you, I don't think about religion in terms of beliefs. I think that that's a distraction. I think that religions tell us all about their beliefs, so we fight over here about beliefs when they're doing the really important social organizing over here. And I think that what drives religious organization and people coming together is commonality and similarity in terms of temperament and perspective and idea and community and all these other kinds of things. And I think that you have a really strong confluence of a certain kind of temperament in conspiracy theory folks. And you've got a lot of them in this Christian nationalism and a lot of them in the Q phenomenon. So there's just a lot of overlap. But how they envision Q in terms of a mythic figure, I don't know that yet. This is something I hope to work on because I find them very interesting.
thank you. And with that, I'm looking at my clock and we've got 3 minutes to wrap up. Emma?
Emma, if I could jump in for a minute, I'll just do a quick wrap up and a couple of announcements. I put some links in the chat. I put a link for Dr. Ingersoll's book. Buy it, please. You've got a little taste of it tonight. I always encourage people to buy from local, but it looked like it was a special order from the local bookstore, so there's the Amazon link for you. I also just posted an article about the idea of, you may have, QAnon language may be familiar or maybe it's not, but I put a link in there for you to look, to learn about how QAnon is kind of being considered a religious phenomenon. And I also wanted to draw attention to our partners, One Jacks, who are having the 103rd annual Interfaith Thanksgiving service on Thursday night, and this will be naturally their first virtual version of that. So I've just put the link in for that as well. You can register for that for free to receive that link, and it'll be online on Thursday night at 6 o'clock. With that, Emma, I'll throw it over to you to wrap us up.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you very much to our speakers, to Julie and Alex. We really appreciate your time and your energy to enlighten us on how faith can be misused for self-serving needs. And thank you to all our listeners today for your comments and your questions. We appreciate all of you joining us and taking interest in our programs, and hope you found the subject matter thought-provoking. I will be posting the presentation on our website under the Mutual Curiosity banner, and I'll also ask Parvez if he might be able to record his presentation and post that separately, so that you get an opportunity to go back and listen to what he would have presented had he been well enough to do so tonight. And then there's an opportunity to share that with family and friends and listen to it again. So our final Mutual Curiosity program for the year will be on Thursday, the 17th of December, and it will be a musical celebration titled A First Coast Christmas. Board member Lucinda Moshe and musicologist Patricia DeWitt will be presenting a short concert by Rare Song, which is a First Coast Renaissance music ensemble. It features 7 professionally trained musicians singing and performing on recorders, viola da gamba, harpsichord and other historical instruments. Their musical performances originally date back to when the Europeans first settled in Northeast Florida, so from around 450 years ago. These pieces would have been known to the colonists either at their home or in their new homes in Florida. So Rare Song brings this period to life through musical performance, costumes and a bit of dialogue. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions about the instruments and the pieces the group performs. So I hope you found value in our program tonight. I hope to see you again on the 17th of December. And we will certainly be bringing more programs to you in the new year. So thank you very much for attending tonight. We really appreciate it. And give me a couple of days and I'll get those presentations up on the website. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Julie and Alex. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Good night.